Okay, so I know that this topic has been talked to death, but I think that it's still kind of relevant that I probably say something about this. But yeah, let's talk about somewhat of a let's do somewhat of a comparison between the old and the modern day and the modern day left. Now, eventually, I am what would call a someone who follows more of the old left's line. That means I have nothing against like patriotism. I have nothing against nationalism. I'm pretty much well aware that not every member of the working class is going to be like super duper progressive and is going to still maintain somewhat of a reactionary mindset. And to an extent, yeah, I mean that sort of mentality eventually, is going to be, can be worked on and can be repaired on the long term. But they're not gonna magically just, decide uh, to become like super duper progressive, right? And this is something that the new left doesn't understand. Not to mention that the new left. Kind of rejects like the notion of nationalism or patriotism because they basically kind of associate it with with fascism or with Nazism or even somewhat integral nationalism for certain people who know what that is. The problem is that it's not only just the synthetic left that does this. I mean, I've seen also a lot of Marxist Leninists that do this, and it's not only just online. I also hear it in like the IRL left. And in France, here in France, we have a word for these people. We call them. So in French, the term is bobo gaucho, or in English would basically mean a boo boo leftist. So eventually, it also comes with this idea of kind of an idea of sensitivity, an idea that they're more based on a moral high ground. Um, it's the same thing. I mean, even and I know that a lot of people like like the person that that I'm going to refer right now. But I know a lot of you like Kill Him Open. But I mean, Kill Him Open. He's also like kind of like the stereotypical like kind of boo boo leftist, where eventually, if you talk anything that has to do with other people who had like somewhat of a violent mindset, we can take Georges Sorel for example, or even like illegalists, right? Illegalists or egoist anarchists, people who like follow like the ideas of Max Stirner, right? Well, eventually, these boo boo leftists will eventually just point the finger and say, "Oh, you're too violent," But at the same time, they'll praise the October Revolution. They'll praise, the Soviet Union. They'll praise. They'll keep bringing up the argument of, oh, but the Soviet Union, like we destroyed fascism, we stopped the Nazis, right? But eventually, if you do bring up any sort of, if you start talking about like violence, or if you do, advocate for somewhat of, either an uprising or attacking the bourgeoisie, then they will basically go on their moral high ground and basically just start pointing fingers and saying, "Oh no, that violence is bad. Violence is bad. We don't do violence um, because X or Y reason, mostly because of somewhat of a moralistic position, right?" So eventually, the problem with that the left faces today is eventually that they're kind of a parody of themselves, I would say. The modern, the modern day leftists, they kind of parody themselves in a lot of ways. I mean, on one hand, they'll praise, they'll praise different, if they're anarchists, they'll praise people like Macron, they'll praise people like, the Scientify, they'll praise the communards, or they'll praise, the Zapatistas down in Chiapas, right? But in the same time, if you do speak about how war is not going to magically end itself, because of course even between socialist states, war can be a possibility. I'm thinking of a conflict that people thought disappeared under the Soviet Union, but really actually didn't. It's just that eventually those two nations didn't have an army to basically wage war against one another. It's the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. That conflict, for example, that never stopped. I mean, in the Soviet Union, Both Azeri SSR politicians and Armenian SSR politicians were basically calling blood on both sides for who will get Nagorno-Karabakh. And as I said, the problem is that the conflict, the thing is that the conflict never manifested itself in a physical form because the Armenian SSR and the Azeri SSR, or Azerbaijani SSR, sorry, didn't have an army, so they couldn't wage war against one another. Basically, tanks couldn't just roll down, Yerevan or Baku, right? Same, we can take Zimbabwe for example. The Zapu Zanu thing, that was pretty much a conflict. Not to mention that also in the Russian Revolution, a lot of warring factions there. So eventually, imagine if the Soviet Union kind of never instigated itself, and all these different left-wing countries existed, like these different socialist states existed, but without a federation. I think war or some ideas of expansionism would still eventually exist in the mindset of many socialist politicians. Doesn't matter if it's from Russia, doesn't matter if it was from Belarus or Poland or Ukraine or Crimea or Tatarstan. Doesn't matter. There would probably have been people who would have had probably somewhat of an expansionist mindset. Or people who just said, oh, but we don't like this faction. This faction is a problem. They're a bit too resistant towards us, so we're basically just going to start a war again, right? And this is my problem with a lot of modern day left wingers, is that eventually they live in kind of this moralistic worldview, right? They live in kind of like a moral place where they think that once we're gonna achieve socialism, everything's gonna be okay. The problem is that even while achieving socialism, there's still going to be numerous problems that are going to have to be fixed, right? And eventually, even geopolitics, that's not magically going to disappear. And same for a lot of institutional things, like, for example, racism. I don't think that racism is going to disappear magically when socialism is going to implement itself. Same, I mean, if you look at numerous socialist states, you still had problems with ethnic strife. I mean, you had, just in East Germany, apparently there's information about race crimes that happen in the GDR that are basically appearing, or being, they're basically being found in the German archives. Same for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, there were ethnic conflicts in the Soviet Union. Doesn't matter if it was between Soviet people or when there was a policy of opening up the doors to people from the third world to come and study in Moscow or Kyiv or Minsk. You still had the local population that basically said they kind of had racist positions and said, hey, what the fuck are you doing in my country, right? That's a problem. That's a problem that didn't really get solved. And other examples were, for example, in Ne Win's Burma. Ne Win, for example, was quite reactionary against Chinese people because of paranoia of thinking that all these Chinese folks will eventually be used as pawns by the Chinese to install somewhat of a Chinese cultural revolution in Burma. So eventually, Ne Win became kind of reactionary against Germans. Gomulka in Poland, he started with somewhat of an anti-Zionist position, but his anti-Zionism evolved into anti-Semitism. Ceausescu, apparently, I've heard from people of Hungarian descent that came from Romania, right? That apparently some Hungarians were being thrown in jail, were being arrested and thrown basically in prison just for being Hungarian. It's the same for apparently during the Vietnam War, when many Vietnamese refugees were being taken in by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. There were anti-Vietnamese riots in Czechoslovakia. So eventually, these problems must be addressed, and I think that even though the modern day left does address racism and says, oh, racism needs to stop, is eventually I don't think that they're bringing actual solutions. They're just saying racism is bad, we need to stop it. Yes, but how? Because, I mean, if you look at a lot of socialist nations, ethnic strife still existed. It was probably not as seen in public, in a lot of everyday situations. But in some specific contexts, eventually these kind of ethnic conflicts eventually blew up and were actually seen, in public. It's the same for war. It's nice to say, oh, well, we're against war. We don't want like to war is bad, guys. We don't want to wage war. But the problem is that eventually, all these different conflicts, these a lot of war doesn't magically stop just because it's a socialist nation. You look again. You can take my example of the Armenian and Azerbaijani SSR politicians who were calling for blood on both sides for Nagorno-Karabakh. So basically, I myself, this is why when people like Comrade Pierre Trudeau says, oh, war technically under capitalism basically is is shit. But eventually, war is a reality that is never going to disappear. It's still going to exist. So eventually, you have Comrade Pierre Trudeau who says, yeah, but, even though war is bad, I'm not necessarily against war. So this is kind of the problem with the modern day left, is that eventually this kind of moralistic position, it brings a lot of idealism, and it doesn't really solve anything. Like, it's just utopian, kind of utopian thinking. I mean, it's not that I'm saying that it's nothing bad. It's not bad to like be against war or racism, but eventually you need to have a long-term and a real viable solution to those kinds of problems. You can't just say, "Oh, war is bad," and bring up some liberal academic study to basically just say, "Well, X, Y, Z is bad, and this is why," and eventually support and eventually by saying that they also support somewhat of a liberal positioning, such as, for example, I'm thinking of all these radlibs who say, oh, but look, immigration is good because it helps the economy. Yeah, but in the same time, by bringing these immigrants, and I'm not necessarily against people from other countries. I'm not saying that to be racist. I'm saying that eventually, I'm kind of worried about these migrants because they're gonna get exploited by mega corporations. And they're gonna, in shit jobs with shit pay, and eventually they're gonna be targeted by, and eventually that creates another conflict. Eventually, it's the local worker who sees his wages going down because the corporations decided to bring in cheap labor from immigrants who are searching for a better life because in their country, shit is not, shit is going bananas. And and eventually it creates to an extent working class strife within a sort of ethnic conflict by bringing the wages down, by rising unemployment for domestic population, just to get cheap labor so that the corporations can basically save money, right? That's another problem that I don't hear a lot of leftists bring up. I mean, the Marxist-Leninists, they bring that up, but I mean, modern day leftists, in the synthetic left, they won't bring that, they rarely bring that up, They rarely bring it up, and this is a problem, right? This is a problem with the modern day leftists. Eventually, they are stuck, on this kind of moralistic position, on this humanistic position, which the old left kind of said, let's be more pragmatic and realistic. I mean, we're not against person Y or person Z, but we need to be realistic and agree that this is not going to magically just disappear, and we need to have genuine, real solutions to stop this. And it's the same for the people who say, oh, but we're all humans and we should live in this giant federation. Well, it's nice to say, but the problem is that eventually there's already historical arguments that eventually showcase that a nation is possible. And if you look at even again, let's bring up to actual existing socialist nations. A lot of existing socialist nations, especially in the third world, I'm thinking of African countries and Asian countries, were strongly nationalistic. They didn't want to, they didn't I mean, sure, you can bring up a lot of African countries, a lot of African socialists supported Pan-Africanism. And same for even in Eastern and Southern Europe with Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union, there were also people who were supporting either a pan-Slavist position or even, and I'm gonna say the no-no word, but even a Eurasianist position. But eventually, for me, again, that's just idealism. In my opinion, that's not a viable thing. So eventually, this is why a lot of socialist countries, especially in Asia, became more focused on a local position, more on a local socialism, more in a X way to socialism, such as in Burma or even in Cambodia. Pol Pot. And people can think whatever they want of Pol Pot, but Pol Pot, kind of wanted a more Cambodian position for what was going on in Cambodia. He wanted a Cambodian way to socialism. And it's the same for Heng Samrin, even though I know that a lot of people don't like Heng Samrin and will say, oh, but Heng Samrin was just a pawn for the Vietnamese. Okay, but he still supported, like, let's say, a local position for Cambodia, even though you can say that the Salvation Front, we can say whatever we want about the Salvation Front, but he still upheld like some domestic policies that basically just had like characteristics for Cambodia. It's the same for India. It's the same for the Indian socialists who supported more of like an Indian way to socialism, or in Indonesia with people like Tan Malaka's National Communism, that he writes in his book Madilog, or even Sukarno. So yeah, that's if that's something for the modern left to kind of reflect on. The modern left needs to kind of, I would say, get their shit together and be a bit more pragmatic and a bit more realistic. That's kind of my cup of tea on the whole, left-wing debacle there. So yeah, I hope you enjoy my rant there, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.